In the summer of 1943, the skies over occupied France belonged to the Luftwaffe. You could measure it in the black smoke that rose from Allied wrecks, in the empty chairs at morning briefings, in the silence that followed a name read from the casualty list. The American 8th Air Force had brought its best: fresh pilots, fresh machines, fresh doctrine, and watched them vanish, one mission at a time, somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 feet. It was the altitude band of death. At that height, the world seemed peaceful, the blue endless, the clouds soft, the land below a patchwork of greens and browns. But hidden in that beauty were Germany's hunters. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s patrolled those layers of sky like wolves on ridgelines. They knew every angle of the sun, every climb rate of the enemy, every weakness of the Thunderbolt. And the Thunderbolt, for all its bulk and horsepower, wasn't built to dance. Captain Robert Bob Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group had learned that the hard way in June. His P-47 had been shredded at 20,000 feet over France, 21 cannon holes through the fuselage, half the control surfaces gone. He'd managed to limp home somehow, trailing smoke, his oxygen system gone, frost forming on his goggles. When he landed, the ground crew counted 21 separate hits, and one bullet lodged in the armor, inches behind his seat. They called him lucky. He called it survival by miracle. By August, the numbers had become unbearable. Between June and September, 214 American fighters were lost over Europe. Not to weather, not to fuel, to German guns and German pilots who owned that altitude. It wasn't courage that was lacking. It was tactics. The manual still preached the gospel of height. Stay above your enemy, fight in the vertical, never surrender altitude. Every instructor at every American training field had repeated it like scripture. Altitude was life. Altitude was advantage. But at the 56th base in Halesworth, one man had stopped believing. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke was a Montana-born pilot with the posture of a prizefighter and the bluntness of a mechanic. He'd studied the enemy long enough to understand that the Germans didn't just fly better, they flew smarter. They dictated the terms of every engagement. They chose when and where to fight. On a humid afternoon in the operations room, Zemke stood before his pilots. The map of Western Europe spread across the wall. Red strings marked bomber routes, black pins marked losses. The patterns were obvious. They're killing us at the same altitude every time, Zemke said. 18,000 to 25. Every time. A few men nodded. Most just stared. He tapped the map again, his finger sliding lower. So, maybe we stop playing their game. Maybe we stop living up there with them. Someone laughed, nervous, incredulous. Sir, you mean go lower? Below 10,000? Zemke looked up. Lower than that. A murmur swept the room. One pilot muttered, That's suicide, sir. Flak'll eat us alive. Maybe, Zemke said. But the way I see it, altitude's killing more of us than flak. He didn't push it further that day. Not yet. But the seed was planted. In the mess that night, the younger pilots whispered about it, flying low, under the radar, under the rules. Some called it madness. Others, quietly, called it hope. 2 days later, Zemke sat alone in his office with the mission report spread before him. Grid coordinates, kill ratios, loss rates. The numbers didn't lie. Every altitude engagement ended the same way. P-47s outclimbed, outturned, and outshot. He reached for a pencil and wrote a single question in the margin. What if the problem isn't the enemy? What if it's the altitude? That night, he walked the flight line under blackout lamps. The hulks of the Thunderbolts stood like sleeping giants, their silver skins dark against the rain. Zemke ran his hand along one of the wings, feeling the rivets beneath his fingers. You're too big for the sky, he murmured. Maybe you belong closer to the ground. It was a heretical thought. Every instinct of every fighter pilot screamed against it. Down low, the air was thick and dangerous. A mistake wasn't measured in altitude. It was measured in seconds. Trees, hills, and flak batteries waited for you. There was no room for error, no time to recover. But up high, the Luftwaffe had made the rules. Down low, there were no rules at all. A week later, at the morning briefing, Zemke gave the order no American commander had dared to give. After escort release, he said, 3 ships, Mahurin, Johnson, and Schilling, will drop to 500 feet and sweep the return route. I want to know what the ground looks like. There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of pencils stopping mid-note. Someone asked, Sir, are we being reassigned to reconnaissance? Zemke smiled faintly. Call it curiosity. If the Luftwaffe owns the sky, maybe we start owning the ground. The briefing ended in confusion and half smiles, but when the engines roared to life that afternoon, 3 P-47s peeled off from formation as the bombers turned for home. They dropped through cloud layers like stones, instruments spinning, the landscape rushing up in a blur of green and brown. At 200 feet, the air changed. The world became a blur of trees, rivers, and villages, the ground flashing past at 350 miles an hour. The pilot's hands gripped the sticks tighter, the horizon a knife edge of motion. They didn't know it yet, but those 3 men had just crossed an invisible boundary, from doctrine into discovery. And before the year was over, the Luftwaffe would learn that the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one above you. It was the one you never saw coming. When the 3 P-47s returned to Halesworth that evening, the ground crews thought they'd been hit. The aircraft were streaked with mud, their belly panels scratched, grass wedged in the cooling vents. One of them, Bob Johnson's, had a dent in the leading edge of the left wing, from a treetop. But the pilots climbed down grinning, adrenaline still flickering in their eyes. Hub Zemke was waiting by the dispersal hut, hands in his pockets. Well? He asked. Johnson was the first to speak. Sir, it's a whole different world down there. Quiet. You can smell the fields before you see them. Flak doesn't touch you till you're right on top of it. Mahurin nodded. And we saw things the Germans probably don't even think we can see. Airfields, trains, fuel trucks. You're right, Colonel. Nobody's looking down there. Zemke said nothing for a long moment. Then he smiled. The sharp, tired smile of a man who's just seen a door open where there was supposed to be a wall. That night, the 56th operations log recorded something innocuous. Low-altitude navigation exercise. 3 aircraft. No one outside the unit gave it a second thought. But among the pilots, the story spread like wildfire. Low altitude became treetop. Navigation became attack. And the men who'd flown it, Johnson, Mahurin, Schilling, became test cases in an unapproved experiment. The next morning, Zemke called them into his office. The door stayed closed for 2 hours. When they came out, they were pale but smiling. Later, Mahurin would remember Zemke's exact words. You're going to do it again. Lower this time. And this time, don't just look. They began flying at dawn and dusk, skimming the English countryside at altitudes that would make any flight instructor faint. Farmers dove for cover as the silver thunderbolts roared past at 350 miles an hour, hedgerows bending in the prop wash. At first, the purpose was observation, studying how the P-47 handled at such speeds and pressures. The results were surprising. The heavy fighter, built for high-altitude interception, was astonishingly stable near the ground. Its weight worked to its advantage, damping out turbulence. The big Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine thrived on the dense air, but the risks were immense. One wrong pull on the stick, one moment's inattention, and the aircraft could meet the earth in an instant. The pilots learned to fly with their eyes half a mile ahead, scanning for wires, towers, even church spires that appeared like blades out of nowhere. When they brought their findings to Zemke, he wrote them down in a notebook that never left his desk. Less than 200 feet, he noted. Radar disappears. Flak ineffective until point blank. Visual detection nearly 0. And then, underlined, speed equals invisibility. By early October, the group had developed what Zemke called hedge-hopping discipline. Each pilot learned to read the terrain like a map, to find rivers, roads, and tree lines, and follow them as cover. Formation flying became a kind of synchronized madness. 4 planes, 20 feet apart, hurtling above the earth, with only instinct and trust keeping them alive. Officially, none of it existed. The Air Force doctrine remained sacred. Altitude, altitude, altitude. But in the pubs around Halesworth, the hedgehoppers, as they were starting to be called, began to attract whispers. One evening, a visiting staff officer from the 8th Fighter Command overheard talk of the low runs. He cornered Zemke in the mess. You're out of your mind, Colonel, he said. You're going to get people killed. Zemke stared at him across the table. They're already dying, just slower. The next mission was the first to cross the channel at treetop height. 12 Thunderbolts from the 56th took off at dawn, climbed to 10,000 to rendezvous with bombers, and then, after the handoff, dropped like stones toward the French countryside. Their altimeters spun to 0. The landscape rushed beneath them. Fields, roads, villages, all blurred together in a green-brown streak. For the first time, German radar stations failed to track the incoming aircraft. They simply vanished. The Freya and Würzburg systems, calibrated for altitude interceptions, were blind below 500 feet, When the Thunderbolts appeared over a Luftwaffe airfield near Amiens, it was chaos. German ground crews scattered as the P-47 screamed across the runway, guns hammering. Fuel trucks exploded. Aircraft lined up for takeoff turned into fireballs. One Thunderbolt took a hit from flak, but even then managed to limp home at mast height, trailing smoke and pieces of cowling. The entire raid lasted less than 3 minutes. Back at base, the pilots were too stunned to speak. Zemke just nodded and said, "Now we know." The after-action report was filed under escort operations, and the details buried in the appendices. But in the following weeks, more and more units began experimenting with low-level tactics, unofficially at first, then under quiet approval. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to battles at altitude, was suddenly losing aircraft on the ground. Radar operators reported phantom raids they couldn't see until the explosions began. In November, Zemke's commanding officer, Colonel Hubert "Hub" Rees, summoned him to London for a meeting at Fighter Command headquarters. The tone was cautious, even hostile. One general asked, "Are you seriously proposing that we teach our pilots to fly at 50 feet? To turn trained fighter escorts into strafers?" Zemke didn't flinch. "Sir," he said, "at 50 feet, physics is on our side, and the Germans don't know it yet." The room went silent. No one could argue with the results. As Zemke left the building that night, the city was dark under blackout. He paused on the steps, looking at the searchlights probing the clouds above. High up there, the war was still being fought, the same way, with the same losses. But down below, where the light couldn't reach, a new kind of war was beginning. And within weeks, the Luftwaffe would discover that death could come not from the sky above, but from the horizon itself. Dawn broke over the English coast in a pale wash of silver, the kind of light that made the channel look like hammered steel. The briefing room at Halesworth was quiet, except for the low hum of the projector. On the wall, a grainy reconnaissance photo showed northern France, a patchwork of fields, rivers, and airfields. Red circles marked the targets. Hub Zemke stood at the front, pointer in hand. "Gentlemen," he said, "today we stop pretending this is an experiment." 12 pilots sat before him, their faces drawn but alert. They had flown the low-level tests. They had seen what happened when altitude disappeared, when the Luftwaffe's radar went blind, and their gunners were still reaching for their helmets as the Thunderbolts roared past. But this would be the first time the tactic became a mission, not an idea. "Our targets," Zemke said, tapping the photo, "are secondary Luftwaffe fields near Beauvais, Amiens, and Beauvais. You'll cross the French coast at 100 feet. I want you to stay low, stay fast, and don't get clever. You're not fighter pilots today. You're ghosts." Someone in the back muttered, "Ghosts with guns." Zemke smiled faintly. "Exactly." They lifted off just after 6. The air was cold enough to frost the canopies, the engines coughing, before catching with a roar that rolled across the airfield. The P-47 Thunderbolts climbed briefly to 5,000 feet to form up, then banked south over the channel. As they reached midpoint, Zemke gave the order over the radio. "Down we go, boys." They dropped like stones. At 200 feet, the horizon turned into a smear of green and brown. At 100, it vanished altogether. The pilots flew by instinct and instruments, their eyes locked on the terrain, whipping past below. Waves of air struck the wings like invisible fists. Every gust threatened to throw them into the ground. Bob Johnson later wrote, "You don't fly the airplane at that height, you wrestle it." The French coastline appeared ahead. Sand, then cliffs, then farmland dotted with smoke from morning fires. The Thunderbolts thundered inland, so low that the shadows of their wings raced across hedgerows. A farmer dropped his plow and dove into a ditch as the first flight screamed overhead. The radar stations along the coast didn't see them. The Freya operators near Dieppe reported nothing but ground clutter. The Luftwaffe air defense network, designed to spot bomber streams at 20,000 feet, was blind to the storm coming at treetop level. The first target came into view, a small airstrip outside Beauvais, half hidden by mist. Through the haze, Johnson spotted the unmistakable silhouettes of FW-190s, parked in rows, wings glinting in the dawn. He didn't call it in. He just dove. At 350 miles an hour, the world turned into motion blur and noise. He lined up the row of fighters in his gun sight and squeezed the trigger. 850 caliber Brownings thundered in unison, tracers tearing across the airfield. The first Focke-Wulf exploded before the gunners even turned their heads. Another burst hit the fuel trucks. A wall of flame rose, scattering men like insects. Behind him, Mahurin's P-47 came in lower, his rounds ripping through the hangar roof. A split second later, the structure erupted, sheets of corrugated metal spinning skyward. It was over in less than 90 seconds. By the time the German flak batteries opened fire, the Thunderbolts were gone, racing south at 50 feet, the roar of their engines fading into the horizon. Zemke's voice crackled over the radio. No stragglers. Home the same way. Low. Crossing back over the coast, they saw a line of tracers chasing them from a battery near Dieppe. The gunners couldn't keep up. Their lead calculations were built for high-altitude bombers. By the time their shells reached the flight path, the P-47s were already a quarter-mile past. When they landed back in England an hour later, the ground crew swarmed them. One mechanic counted 7 branches stuck in a wing root. Another found pieces of straw jammed into a cooling vent. "How low did you fly, sir?" he asked Mahurin. Mahurin grinned. "If there'd been a fence, we'd have taken it with us." Zemke gathered the pilots in the dispersal hut. "Reports." Johnson pulled off his gloves, still shaking from the adrenaline. "Airfield destroyed. 4 confirmed aircraft on the ground. No losses." Zemke's jaw tightened. He looked around the room at the exhausted, grinning faces. "Gentlemen, that's the first time in this war we've killed the Luftwaffe before they took off." The after-action report that night was written in Zemke's careful, understated style. Results indicate ground-level approach yields total tactical surprise. Enemy airfields vulnerable to immediate, concentrated low-altitude attack. Recommend expansion of method. He didn't mention that his pilots had broken every rule of air combat in the manual. 2 days later, the photographs came back from reconnaissance. The airfields they'd hit were wrecked, blackened craters, charred fuselages, hangars flattened. The Luftwaffe's own after-mission logs, later intercepted, told the other half of the story. No radar warning. Aircraft destroyed on ground. Attack came without notice. Impossible to intercept. Zemke sent the photos to Fighter Command with a single sentence attached. "If this is suicide, gentlemen, we should keep dying like this." By mid-October, hedge-hopping flights were running weekly. Other groups began to adopt the tactic. Pilots compared notes, shared maps of terrain features, and painted small green stripes on their cowlings, a quiet badge of the low flyers. The Luftwaffe didn't yet know what was happening. Their radar operators kept reporting ghosts. Their pilots sat on runways, engines idling, unaware that death was coming at them from 50 feet off the ground. In the next weeks, those ghosts would return, faster, lower, and deadlier than before. And when they did, the skies over France would tilt forever in America's favor. By late October 1943, the low-flying Thunderbolts had stopped being an experiment and become a weapon. The 56th Fighter Group was rewriting the rulebook of aerial warfare one mission at a time. Every dawn over England now began the same way. 12 P-47s roaring down the runway, climbing briefly through mist, then plunging toward the channel until the altimeters read numbers that made flight surgeons wince. Hub Zemke had started calling it flying the hard deck. For most pilots, the deck was the ground. For his men, it was the new frontier. At 50 feet, speed was your armor, and the earth was your ally. The physics were brutal but beautiful. At that altitude, the air was thick and dense, feeding the R-2800 engines more oxygen than they could ever drink at 20,000 feet. The Thunderbolt's immense weight, nearly 7 tons loaded, made it stable, a steel arrow slicing through the turbulence that tossed lighter aircraft like paper. The slipstream from the propeller pressed the air down and outward, creating a cushion that made the plane float above the ground at high speed. The result was counterintuitive. The faster you went, the safer you became. The men learned quickly that anything below 300 miles per hour was suicide. At that speed, German gunners had time to track you. At 350, you were a blur. At 400, you were already gone by the time the first shell burst. Zemke began teaching what he called terrain intuition. He made his pilots memorize the shapes of the land, how valleys funneled wind, how tree lines hid flak emplacements, how rivers glinted in the morning light and betrayed your position if you followed them too long. Every field became a landmark, every shadow a potential death trap. In England, they practiced on mock runs across the countryside. The locals got used to the thunderclap roar of engines passing so low that church steeples rattled. Farmers started hanging signs that read, "God bless Zemke's fools." The training was merciless. Pilots who flew too high were sent back up to repeat the run until their bellies ached from holding the stick forward. One young lieutenant clipped a row of haystacks and returned with straw wrapped around his wing struts. When his crew chief shouted that he could have killed himself, he just grinned and said, "Next time, I'll aim for something softer." But the results spoke for themselves. On November 3rd, a 12-ship flight, led by Bob Johnson, struck a German supply convoy near Rouen. The trucks never had a chance. At 60 feet, the Thunderbolts came in from behind a tree line and opened fire at point-blank range. The first 2 trucks exploded. The rest scattered into the ditches. German gunners fired wildly into the sky, convinced the attack had come from above. The after-action photo showed what looked like a road erased from the map. When intelligence reviewed the mission, they realized something extraordinary. The radar stations along the convoy's route hadn't seen a thing. The Thunderbolts had slipped completely below detection range. The analysts wrote a new term into their reports: ground clutter evasion. Zemke smiled when he read it. We call it living in the noise. But every advantage came with a cost. Flying that low for hours was a test of human endurance as much as mechanical. The pilots lived in a constant state of controlled panic. Their eyes watered from the wind blast, their hands cramped from the strain of micro-adjustments on the stick. They learned to sense the terrain, not by sight, but by feel. The way the air thickened near a ridge, the way the light changed before a power line flashed past. Flak became less predictable, but far more terrifying. The 20mm guns designed to shred bombers at high altitude could barely keep up with a low flyer. But when they did hit, they hit hard. One shell could shear off a wing. Every mission ended with at least one Thunderbolt limping home, oil streaming from the cowling, bullet holes stitched across the fuselage. The ground itself fought back. One pilot died after hitting a bird, a pheasant, no bigger than a football, that shattered his windscreen and broke his neck. Another clipped the top of a barn and tore off half his elevator, but somehow managed to land. Every death was personal, every loss a lesson. Zemke began holding nightly debriefings, not to assign blame, but to study patterns. At altitude, you fight tactics, he told them. Down here, you fight physics. He made the engineers at Republic Aviation aware of what they were doing. Within weeks, the factory sent out modified P-47 belly plates, reinforced with quarter-inch armor, to protect against debris strikes. Mechanics started wrapping hydraulic lines with steel mesh to keep branches from cutting them open. The pilots began calling their aircraft mud fighters. By late November, even London was taking notice. Fighter Command sent an observer to Halesworth to watch one of the hedge-hopping runs. He rode in the back seat of a trainer at 200 feet and returned white as chalk. His report read simply: effective but insane. Insanity or not, the numbers didn't lie. In the months since the first mission, Zemke's group had destroyed more than 50 enemy aircraft on the ground, dozens of trains and fuel depots, and had lost only 3 planes in combat. Their kill ratio had flipped, from desperation to dominance. Back in France, the Luftwaffe began to realize something was changing. Airfield commanders started ordering dispersal of their aircraft into wooded areas. Flak batteries were repositioned further from runways, but the Americans adjusted just as fast. They attacked from the sun, from behind hills, from angles that radar couldn't predict. One German report, intercepted by Allied intelligence, captured the panic in a single line. They come from nowhere. The noise is the first and last thing you hear. In December, Zemke stood before his pilots with a new map. We've proven it works, he said. Now we make it doctrine. No more experiments. The men around him were exhausted, unshaven, their flight suits smelling of oil and cordite. But they nodded. They understood. They were no longer just pilots. They were practitioners of a new art form, one painted in speed, smoke, and dirt. Outside, the engines of their Thunderbolts were already warming up, the sound rolling across the frozen field like thunder over the sea. From that day forward, the Luftwaffe would look up into the sky for its enemies. But death would keep coming from below, silent, unseen, and unstoppable. By the first week of December 1943, the German airfields in northern France were no longer sanctuaries. They had become hunting grounds. The men who once drank their morning coffee beside neatly lined Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts now woke to the sound of machine gun fire and explosions tearing through the dawn. The hedgehoppers had arrived, and the Luftwaffe didn't even know how to see them. The first sign that something was wrong came from a radar station near Le Havre. The operators had been tracking a returning bomber formation at 20,000 feet when the blip suddenly multiplied. Hundreds of phantom contacts flickering at ground level, then vanishing. They dismissed it as interference. 40 minutes later, the Amiens airfield went silent. What had happened there would become legend in the 56th Fighter Group. At 0730 hours, 32 P-47 Thunderbolts crossed the French coast in 4-ship elements, hugging the terrain so tightly that the slipstreams flattened wheat fields and ripped laundry from village lines. The flight was led by Major Francis Gabby Gabreski, a quiet man with a killer's focus. His orders from Zemke were simple. Don't climb, don't linger, hit them fast and disappear. The formation reached Amiens at 0742. The Germans had no warning. 2 staffels of FW-190s were parked on the tarmac, engines idling for a morning patrol. Mechanics were still tightening cowling bolts. Refueling trucks were lined up like dominoes. The thunderbolts appeared out of the haze, silver flashes skimming the trees. By the time the first flak gun fired, the Americans were already on top of them. Gabreski's gun camera would later show 10 seconds of controlled devastation. His 8 Brownings opened up at 300 yards, rounds walking through parked aircraft, fuel drums, and men diving for cover. The first 190 exploded, then another. The third burst into flames as its pilot was halfway up the ladder. Behind Gabreski, Mahurin's flight strafed the runway. One of his bursts caught a refueling truck. The explosion lifted the vehicle off the ground and flipped it into a hangar, which collapsed in a sheet of flame. The shockwave rolled across the field, knocking down mechanics and scattering debris like shrapnel. The Germans who survived those first few seconds never forgot the sound. The thunderous, bone-shaking howl of radial engines tearing through the morning air at 400 miles per hour. Some mistook it for bombers falling from the sky. Others thought it was artillery. None realized until too late that it was death, flying just above the grass. The raid lasted 3 minutes. When the last P-47 pulled up to treetop height and roared away to the west, 21 Focke-Wulfs were burning. The airfield was unrecognizable, blackened, cratered, littered with twisted aluminum. The Luftwaffe lost more planes in that single attack than they had shot down in the previous week. For the Germans, it wasn't the loss that hurt the most. It was the humiliation. The reports filed that afternoon from regional commands were confused, almost panicked. 1, written by an Oberst at Rouen, read, "Enemy fighters approached without radar warning. Visual contact only at extreme proximity. Attack from horizon. Reaction impossible." The term attack from horizon began appearing across German dispatches. It described something that their doctrine didn't account for, an assault not from above, but from below. At Jagdfliegerführer 3 headquarters, near Paris, General Walter Grabmann called an emergency conference. He read the after-action reports aloud to a room full of officers who looked as though they'd been slapped. "You tell me," he said, "how an aircraft that big flies unseen across 50 miles of France." No one had an answer. The Luftwaffe had built its entire air defense on height. Radar nets calibrated for bombers, flak patterns designed for altitude, fighter patrols positioned miles above the clouds. They had ruled the vertical. Now the enemy was fighting in a dimension they had ignored, the surface itself. Grabmann ordered new standing patrols at low altitude, but the Bf-109s, assigned to intercept the Americans, found the job nearly suicidal. At 50 feet, there was no margin for error. One misjudged turn, one gust of wind, and a pilot could meet the ground in a heartbeat. Within a week, 3 German fighters had crashed while simply trying to hold pursuit altitude. The low sky belonged to the Thunderbolts. In the next 10 days, hedge-hopping flights struck 8 airfields and a dozen supply convoys. The attacks were over before the Germans could even start their engines. Intelligence intercepts revealed growing desperation in Luftwaffe communications. One message from Luftflotte 3 to Berlin read, "Immediate reinforcement of flak batteries requested. Current defenses insufficient. New American tactic. Cannot predict." Zemke read that line in his operations hut and smiled. "If they can't predict," he said, "they can't survive." But for all the triumph, he knew how fragile it was. Every low-level run carried its own risks. 2 of his best pilots had been lost that week. One clipped a power line near Dieppe, another disappeared over the Somme, likely hitting a hill hidden by fog. The hedgehoppers were winning the war of surprise, but physics still claimed its toll. Back in France, the psychological effect was spreading faster than the destruction. German pilots began sleeping in their flight suits, afraid they wouldn't make it to their aircraft in time if the Americans came at dawn. Ground crews started parking planes miles away from runways, hiding them behind barns and haystacks. It didn't matter. The P-47s just followed the smoke. On December 11th, a Luftwaffe colonel inspecting an airfield near Evreux watched in disbelief as 3 Thunderbolts appeared out of nowhere and strafed his convoy. The colonel barely escaped. His driver didn't. Later, his written report summed up the new reality in a single bitter sentence. "The Americans no longer come from the sky. They come from the ground." That winter, across occupied France, the legend of the hedgehoppers grew. To the Germans, they were invisible predators. To the Americans, they were proof that courage could bend physics. And to Hub Zemke, standing on a frost-covered runway in Suffolk and watching his battered Thunderbolts return from another raid, they were something even simpler. The proof that war could be rewritten, 50 feet at a time. By January 1944, the Hedgehoppers had become both heroes and ghosts. Their missions were no longer brief experiments or secret trials. They were routine, scheduled, coordinated, deadly. Every dawn, the sound of the thunderbolts shaking the English airfields meant another raid into the low sky of occupied France. Every dusk, the empty chairs in the mess hall reminded them of what it cost. The 56th Fighter Group had discovered the perfect ambush, but it was an ambush that could turn on them in a heartbeat. Hub Zemke's pilots were flying at an altitude where the ground wasn't a distant concept, it was a constant threat. At 350 miles per hour, a 2-degree mistake on the stick could mean death in less than a second. The men began to understand that their greatest enemy wasn't the Luftwaffe, or flak, or even fate. It was gravity itself. Bob Johnson said it best after one of his closest calls. Up high, you die in combat. Down low, you die stupid. On January 12th, Lieutenant Frank O'Reilly clipped a church steeple during a strafing run near Rouen. His wing sheared off, and his Thunderbolt cartwheeled into a field. There was nothing left to bury. 2 days later, Lieutenant Dan Mercer struck a power line hidden in the mist. His plane exploded mid-air, the copper wire slicing through the fuselage like a whip. The crash site was marked by a smoldering trench across a French orchard. They called those deaths pilot error in the reports, but everyone knew better. Flying that low, error was inevitable. Survival depended on fear, a healthy, constant awareness that death could appear from anywhere. The moment a pilot stopped being afraid, he was finished. Zemke understood this better than anyone. He'd grounded more than one man for overconfidence. One pilot, a brash Texan named Harper, had flown under a railway bridge during a mock training run. He returned laughing, bragging that he could have reached out and touched the girders. Zemke called him into his office, shut the door, and said, "If you ever do that again, I'll court-martial you myself. You don't prove courage by playing chicken with God." Harper nodded, silent. A week later, he was killed when his wingtip struck a tree during a turn. Fear kept the survivors alive. The physical strain was relentless. Low-level flying required constant adjustments, micro-corrections that made the hands and forearms ache, the eyes burn, the spine lock. After 2 hours at hedge height, pilots would land with their flight suits soaked in sweat despite the winter cold. Some couldn't hold a coffee cup afterward. Their hands shook too badly. Flight surgeons began noticing something new: tremors, sleep disorders, and what they called altitude confusion. The psychological dissonance of living on the ground after hours of skimming it at impossible speeds. A few pilots developed an obsession with this sensation, the rush of trees flashing past below. They began flying lower and lower on each mission. Zemke feared that kind of addiction more than enemy fire. "If you start enjoying it," he warned, "you're already dead." By February, the Hedgehoppers were legends in England. Newspaper correspondents tried to interview them, but most refused. Their missions were classified, their losses understated. To the outside world, they were just another fighter group doing escort work. The truth, that they were quietly rewriting the laws of air warfare, was known only to a handful of commanders. Even the engineers at Republic Aviation were struggling to keep up. They reinforced the Thunderbolt's lower cowling with armor, added wire cutters to the wings, and replaced the fragile gun sights with gyroscopic models designed for quick targeting at short range. One prototype even had a thin steel brush guard fitted beneath the oil cooler, not to stop bullets, but branches. Every modification came from blood. The Germans adapted too, or tried to. They began scattering their aircraft in forests, hiding them under camouflage nets. But that only slowed the inevitable. P-47s learned to follow tire tracks, the gleam of metal, the pattern of shadows across a clearing. Once found, a hidden airfield became a killing ground. Still, for every German loss, an American name appeared on the board back at Halesworth. Zemke would walk the line of returning aircraft, counting the gaps. He never asked if anyone had seen them go down. He already knew. At night, the base was quiet. The pilots sat in the mess, drinking coffee that had long since gone cold, staring into nothing. They talked less now. The laughter that had once filled the rooms had been replaced by a heavy silence. They'd stopped telling stories about near misses and lucky escapes. Every man had his own ghost to keep him company. The strain began to show, even on Zemke. His hair had gone silver at the temples, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. He spent his nights reviewing mission film, watching the gun camera footage frame by frame, each burst of tracers, each explosion frozen in time. When asked why, he said simply, "Because every frame is someone's life." But the missions continued. They had to. The invasion of Europe was coming, and air superiority would decide whether the beaches of Normandy became a victory or a massacre. The hedgehoppers were no longer just experimental. They were essential. In late February, Zemka received a telegram from Fighter Command. Prepare for expanded operations. Low-level sweeps to precede upcoming ground offensive. Emphasis on radar suppression. Airfield neutralization. Continue at current altitude discipline. He read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. That night, as he walked the line of P-47s gleaming under the floodlights, he placed his hand on the cold metal of one engine cowling and whispered, "You've killed men and saved more. Now you'll decide a war." Above him, the English sky was dark, empty, and silent. The high altitudes the Luftwaffe once ruled now abandoned. The battle had moved closer to the ground, to the realm of smoke, mud, and speed. And in that thin layer of air between the earth and eternity, the hedgehoppers prepared for their most dangerous mission yet, one that would change not just the war, but the very meaning of flight itself.